All right, as the new vice president, can you just tell me what is the emergency that our community manager can't handle herself?
The large air conditioner on the clubhouse is leaking.
Well, I think that's covered under our regular routine maintenance crew. They can take care of that.
Yes, but there's water damage to the roof and the tiles are falling into the training room.
We have money in our capital improvement fund for that, don't we?
You don't seem to understand. The tiles are falling from the ceiling on the exercise equipment.
You know, the exercise equipment is covered by our reserves. We got money for that.
We need to call an emergency meeting.
Well, it's easy. Call the president and make the appointment.
I can't. He was on the treadmill when the ceiling tiles fell in.
I give up. I give up. Maintaining your community assets and maintaining adequate reserves are two fundamental building blocks of a successful community.
Hello, I'm Mary Rendina, Executive Director of the Nevada Chapter of the Community Associations Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the CAI media presentation. CAI provides comprehensive education to board members, homeowners, and community managers. This presentation series, developed by CAI's Nevada Chapter, brings educational information to board members all around our state, and it has been developed and presented by experienced board members, all of whom have completed CAI's award-winning Decal Education Series. We thank our generous sponsors who make these free presentations possible.
We at the Nevada Real Estate Division applaud you for volunteering to serve as a board member on your homeowners association.
Board members play a vital role in successful HOA management, which is why we believe that board member training and ongoing education is critical.
We're proud to support the effort of CAI's Nevada chapter to provide this innovative digital media training.
We'd also like to remind you that you can also contact the Real Estate Division or CAI for additional help.
Enjoy the presentation.
Hello, I'm Greg Toussaint, and welcome to this presentation on asset maintenance and reserves. I'm joined today by Kate Lindsay, and we both completed CAI's Decal program, or Dedicated Community Association Leader, which means we've taken about 25 hours of classes and performed other work for CAI to achieve this designation. I'd like Kate, to introduce yourself and your background with your community, because it's quite different than mine.
My name is Kate Lindsay, and I've been involved with our association for about 7 years. I became a decal in 2013, and I'm the first decal in our association. I live in a 96-unit condo complex that was built between 72 and 74. In addition to the actual living spaces, we've got certain amenities like a pool and a clubhouse and a tennis court. And we've struggled in the recent past trying to make sure we could maintain all of them properly. But now we're back on top, and it's going quite well.
Great. Well, my background is quite different. While Kate is from the condominium community environment, I'm from the single-family homes environment. I've been on my board longer than I care to remember, many years. We have a 300-home community surrounding a lake. It's gated community and private streets. So we actually have looked at these things, especially asset maintenance and reserves, from a completely different point of view, because in a condominium community, it's quite different. You have a lot more issues than you do in a single family. So we hope that our experience and training will benefit you in your community. We're going to have a 4-part presentation. We're going to present ways you can preserve the value of your assets in your community, which is really important, because those are what makes your community special. At the same time, we want to make sure that the funds are available to pay for maintenance and repairs as they're required. So, Kate, why don't you start off by explaining why is maintenance so important? I mean, can't we just wait until we have the funds and fix it then? Because sometimes it's a little difficult.
Well, have you ever taken a road trip without a road map? Just gotten in the car and gone somewhere?
Yes.
Yes. And did you get there easily and quickly, or did you run into some problems along the
We
way?
actually got there eventually.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Well, the reason that you want to really pay attention to maintenance within your community is if you're not reading the roadmap, you're not going to get where you need to be when you need to be there. Imagine that you're a new home buyer and you're coming in and you're considering buying in the community and there's a broken gate or overgrown plants. Or maybe it's a longtime resident who's been paying their assessments every month and they look around and the community pool isn't in play because there's a leak, so it can't be open this year. A well-maintained complex is going to help the property maintain values, bring in new owners, and keep the existing owners happy, which is definitely what you want to do. Most important to me, when economic conditions turn and you may not have as many people able to keep current on their assessments, if you've got that maintenance plan in place and you're following that roadmap, you're going to be able to manage those bumps and hurdles a lot easier, and your HOA is not going to fall into any kind of disrepair. This is why it's necessary to learn about reserves. RFP, which is a request for proposal, it is not RAF, which is the British military, and association project management, and hopefully that's what you'll learn today.
Great. Well, I think it is a key responsibility for the board is to make sure that you maintain those assets. There's all kinds of maintenance, though, isn't there? Really, I mean, there's not just there's all kinds of things I can think of. Can you kind of break it down into various categories of what sort of maintenance HOAs and common interest communities have to deal with?
I think they sort of fall into four basic categories. There's routine, preventative, scheduled, also known as deferred or reserve, and then emergency, and that's the one you definitely want to avoid at all costs. Preventative work is what you're doing every month. It's what you're doing every quarter. You can see that in your annual budget. It's the kind of things that you want to keep track of on a regular basis, like landscaping or gate repair. Then there's preventative, which is going to be more along the lines of replastering the pool or replacing the pool pumps. Might not be done as frequently, so instead of being part of your annual budget and paid out of operating, it could actually be paid out of reserves or operating, depending on what it is.
So you're actually doing maintenance to prevent breakdowns and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. You don't want that gate to break down, so you do quarterly or annual maintenance on it, and that way it's prevented.
Right.
Then there's going to be scheduled, deferred, or reserved, depending on what your organization calls it. And these are going to be the big projects. This is going to be replacing a perimeter wall, which is something that we're looking at right now. It's quite a large project. It's taking a lot of time to put together, and you want to make sure you have the funds available to pay for it when it happens. The last type is the one we all want to avoid, and it's the emergency. It's when there's that water geyser shooting out of the street at 2 a.m. and you have to have the plumber and the street people shut off water to the buildings. It's something you generally can't avoid, but you do want to be prepared to pay for when it happens. It could actually either be reserve or it could even be insurance, depending on the issue. So I'd say when you're looking at maintenance within the CIC, you want to make sure that you're looking at these four basic types and try and stay organized with them, and you're going to be just fine.
So maintaining the assets is like probably the most important thing you do as a board member.
Definitely.
Certainly is the most money.
So Greg, we've talked a little bit about completing maintenance, and we've got to have money in order to do the maintenance. But I'm looking at our reserves, and we've got this huge pot of money. Why do we need to keep contributing to the reserve?
Well, the board is responsible to maintain adequate reserves, which is a general term, which means that you will have the money there when needed. So you have lots of elements that are being maintained from time to time. You have to have the money in the bank. You can't just hope that nothing bad happens. For example, if the pool is, you may raise the issue of pool is empty because there's a leak, you're not going to be very popular as a board member if you haven't got the reserves in place to fix that pool so that the kids can go in the pool. So that's something that as a board member you have a duty to make sure that pool's there, because people bought into that association assuming they had a pool, as an example. And you don't want to use operating funds to fix these things because operating funds are already spoken for. right? You got a budget and everything is, every dollar is laid out. And you definitely don't want to do the worst thing you have to do, and that is to vote for a special reserve assessment.
Well, wait a minute though. Why would a special assessment be such a bad thing? I mean, if you've got a big project, then you put out the special assessment, you get the money, you pay for it, you're done.
Do you like your neighbors?
Well, yes, most of them at least.
Because, you know, they're not going to be happy with you when they suddenly have a $500 bill to pay that they hadn't expected. It's not in their budget. And your budget didn't obviously account for the need to do something. And if you have 100 homes and each puts in $500, that's a ton of money that wasn't properly budgeted for.
So we want to avoid that special assessment.
You definitely want to do that. But if you're, you know, smart home buyers, when they're going to buy a home in a community in an HOA, smart ones will look to see, well, what are they, 20% of their recommended funds in place, or is it 80% of the recommended funds in place? Because if they're underfunded, you know what's going to happen.
Special assessment.
You're going to get a special assessment, or at least a lot of assessment increases in the coming years. And no one wants to move into a community that's underfunded because they know what's going to happen. A well-maintained community, as you said earlier, increases property values. You want to make the community look good so that people want to buy in your community, because when you want to sell your home someday, there'll be buyers wanting to buy your home.
So in order to do all of this, we're going to need to have the money available. Mm-hmm. We've got our operating budget, but we've got a reserve budget. Mm-hmm. What exactly is the reserve study? How do you figure out how much to put into your reserve funds so that you know how to budget?
Well, the reserve study is actually something that's very boring to read, but very important to your community. You will have it prepared by a reserve specialist who are registered with the state of Nevada as being competent to provide quality reserve studies to your community. And it has to be done at least once every 5 years. So you can not just go on and on and on until you decide you want to have another reserve study. You need to do it at least every 5 years, and often you'll update it more frequently. It will recommend to the board how much money you should be contributing to your reserves every year.
Okay.
Which is then part of your operating budget. That's how much you're supposed to put in, so you make sure that your reserves are being adequately funded. It will list all the assets, or what they're typically called in the reserve study, components. You know, it could be a clubhouse, it could be furniture, it could be a fence, it could be gates, whatever elements that make up your community, and every community is different. You have to fund reserves for those elements in case they fail, in case they need to be replaced, need to be refurbished, what have you. And all those components, each component that's listed, there'll be a schedule of when maintenance is likely to be needed. The reserve specialists are trained to know that, okay, your pool pump is 5 years old. It's probably got another 5 years of life, let's say. And you're probably going to have it serviced every 2 years.
Okay.
So that will be in there, and they'll tell you what approximately it'll cost to have that pool pump serviced. So you'll know what to reserve. Your reserve study will know what you need to put into your reserves every year to make sure that the money is there for that pool pump. If you want to know what the remaining life is, as I mentioned before, if it's got 5 more years, you're going to have to replace it probably in about 5 years. And again, the reserve specialist doesn't know for sure. He knows approximately when that might happen. He'll also know the approximate cost to do that repair or replacement when it's needed.
So that's how we avoid that special assessment, because the reserve has estimated when it's going to need to be prepared and fixed, and then we can take a look at that. Right. We know in 5 years we're going to need to replace that pool pump.
And that's how the reserve specialist determines how much you need to contribute. Here's how much you've got. Here's how much you need to put in every year so that you have the funds when they're needed. Okay. And it should be updated as needed, and we'll talk more about that. But at this point, we're going to conclude our first segment. In our next segment, we'll discuss the reserve study in a lot more detail and begin the process of planning a project. Hi, and welcome back. Kate, you know, a reserve study as we just talked about, is really just a guess, isn't it? I mean, everything is a guess by the reserve specialist. Why is it so important that we follow it, try to follow it closely?
Well, the reserve study is going to be part roadmap and part recommendation, and having this information is going to be vital because the association board is responsible to fund the reserve and maintain the association assets. And it sounds like it's a huge legal issue, but it's really basically having the money to pay for the projects when the projects are due. You need to follow the study as best you can, but you also have to be a little bit flexible. Sometimes scheduled repairs can wait another year, but they're going to continue to be flagged in the reserve study. So for example, every year we're doing our budget, we look at our reserve study, and the recommendation is that we should replace the refrigerator in the clubhouse. The refrigerator is doing just fine, does not need to be replaced in any way.
Still cold?
Still cold, keeps the ice cold. But it's still a line item in the reserve study, and it says that we should have replaced it 2 years ago. We didn't need to. So you don't have to spend the funds in the reserve study on exactly what it says to do in exactly the year it says to do it, but you need to address those items that are in that reserve study for the current year.
The money needs to be in there when it does fail.
Exactly.
It needs to be there. Right.
When we get 2 years out and suddenly we have ice water on the floor instead of in the refrigerator, that's when you know you've got to have the money available. You also have to really pay attention to any necessary maintenance. So for example, never defer maintenance that could directly affect the safety of your residents or the value of your community. It's possible that you may not have the funds in operating to make routine reserve contributions. If that's the case, you may have to make the very difficult and unpopular decision to do that special assessment. So to give you a different example, we need to perform maintenance on that gate, but maybe we haven't been saving enough in reserves to do the maintenance on that gate, but it's got to be done or maybe even replaced. That might be a point in time when you have to do a special assessment. The problem there, though, you're going to have to explain to your homeowners that the reason you're getting a special assessment is because you delayed funding your reserves, even though the reserve analyst recommended that you put X amount of dollars in each month. You didn't do it, and now they've got to take it out of their own pockets.
You got to pay the piper eventually, right?
You got it. And the other part that most people don't really think about is the insurance company. If you don't do the expected maintenance on those streets and something happens, somebody falls, there's a car that drives through a pothole, loses an axle, the insurance company may choose not to cover it because you chose not to do the maintenance or not to fund the reserve.
I would say that if you're considering doing something like not funding your reserves fully, the first thing you do is you talk to your reserve specialist before you make that decision, because you need to know what the implications might be down the road. Exactly.
We had talked earlier about a reserve study needing to be done every 5 years. But is there ever a reason why we need to update it more frequently?
Absolutely. The thing about a reserve study is that it's a static document. It tells you what reserve funds you're going to be spending in the next X years. But communities aren't static. Like you said, you didn't replace the refrigerator when you were supposed to, according to the reserve specialist. But it was working just fine, and why would you want to replace it early? Now, that's a small, relatively small expense. But what if it was a large expense? And suddenly it affects your reserve study. Your reserve study thinks you have done one thing and you've done something else, or not done something.
Like not replace the asphalt in the street.
Exactly. In fact, I have some personal experience with something like that, where the board got misled because they didn't follow the schedule that the reserve specialist had, and for good reason, but they allowed it to mislead them on how much money. And I'll try to explain this as quickly as I can. Okay. Your reserve study calls for a $20,000 a year contribution to reserves. And that's what the board is doing. They're putting $20,000 a year into reserves. And there's also repaving the streets. It's supposed to occur this year. The streets need to be repaved, and it's going to cost $75,000. Okay. It's a lot of money. The board looks at the streets and says, we can put this off another year. They look fine. It's okay. which so they do. Later in the year, in year one, later in the year, they begin to do their budget for next year. And they look at the reserve study and says, well, how much money are we supposed to have for next year? And it says you're going to have this certain amount. And they discover they've got way more money in the reserve account than they're supposed to. It's like 125% of what's recommended. And they congratulate themselves on what a great job they're doing and decide, you know, we probably have better places for that $20,000 a year we're putting in. Why would we want to put $20,000 in when we're 125% of what we're supposed to have?
Well, I'd have to agree with that.
It sounds logical, right? If you don't think about the fact that you were supposed to spend $75,000 and didn't.
Oh.
So they decide not to make that contribution.
Okay.
The next year comes around and they in fact do repave the streets. And they begin then to look at their reserve study for their next year's budget and have suddenly found that they're only 60% reserved.
Oh, because now they've had to pay for the streets.
And they didn't put the 20,000 in.
20,000 in.
So now, guess what? They're in a lot of trouble, right? They're going to have to raise assessments because they made a mistake. What they should have done is when they know they're making a significant change to their reserve spending, update the reserve study, or have someone tasked with that job to make sure that everybody knows we're going to spend $75,000 this year that's not shown in that year. It actually showed the prior year. It's a little confusing, but if you stop making contributions because you think it's a good idea, check with your reserve specialist first. He will tell you, excuse me, when are you going to do that street? Oh, next year. You better keep putting your money in, or you're going to find yourself in trouble. So that's an example I have some personal experience with. And if you're a board member, don't do it without talking to your reserve specialist.
Always talk to your expert.
Exactly. And I'll just add a couple more comments on reserves. It's critical that you have a reserve study with all the assets listed. And you may think that as a board member that's not your job, but you know the community better than that reserve specialist does. So when it comes time to do your reserve study, a knowledgeable board member and the manager should probably go through the entire community with that reserve specialist so he knows or she knows, yes, that's part of, we maintain that. No, that's the homeowners. No, that's a city street. So that he knows or she knows exactly what elements comprise your community. All right, Kate, your turn. Some maintenance projects are pretty easy. It doesn't require a lot of thought. You know, it's easy. But when you're facing a complex project, you know, it can be a lot to take in. Where do you start? Where do you go?
I love project planning. This is one of the most fun
There's something
things
wrong
I
with
do.
you.
I think that it's so exciting to be able to find a project, find an issue, create a solution, and then see it through to the end. And I think that if more board members considered it that way, they'd have a lot more fun when they were working on these projects.
I like the end part.
Yeah, well, the end always comes. That's the cool part. And then guess what? You get to do another project.
Yep.
So the hard part, I think, for most people is identifying what they need to do and what they've got to do first. And the first thing to do is look at your annual budget and look at your reserve study. These are places where someone else, an expert, has already identified things that you've got to monitor. I say to look at your annual, including and your reserve, because both of them are going to give you key indicators as to what you want to do next. Maybe the monthly or the annual budget, you've got a landscaping component. And in that landscaping component, your vendor suddenly comes up with an idea that maybe you should replace a large section of irrigation. That goes out of your annual and could possibly go into your reserve. So the two kind of tie together. They give you reference points from where you're going to start.
They also tell you probably how much you're going to spend.
Exactly.
If you have to replace something.
That's the other part. When I do a project at home, I don't always know what the outside costs are going to be going in. But when I do a project with the HOA, I've got the reserve study I can refer to. It's going to have recommended amounts to pay for the project, and it may even have recommendations on things you can do in order to delay or improve your project completion. So for example, let's talk about the streets. If you slurry the streets every 2 years, you can put off having to do a complete remove and replace. And in some cases, you even need to do the slurry in order to keep the warranties good. That's going to be in your reserve study, and that recommendation is going to be there along with the dollar amount. It means that every time you put those funds into your reserves, you're identifying where those funds are going to go, and then you're going to know what project you need to do and what project you're going to need to do first. Now, my other favorite thing, the thing that I love, the thing that I keep up in our community, this is your completed project list. And it is something that the homeowners or that the board members are maintaining. This isn't maintained by the community manager because they've got a lot of communities they manage and we only have one. We're better adept at keeping something like this current. We actually hang this in the clubhouse, and as we have our meetings, we can go in, make a notation, and then eventually somebody will take it home, update the Excel spreadsheet, print out a new one, and we start over again. It includes the project, when it was completed, and even the vendor. You can include more information here if you want to, but what's cool about this is, let's say every 2 years or 3 years, we have to go through and we've got to do maintenance or at least an inspection on the roofs of our condo complex. You can go through your financials, try and figure out which vendor you used, or you can go to your project list. You can see when roofs were worked on last, who did it, and whether or not you gave them an A+ for what they did. This gives you an idea of where you've been, and it can really show you where you need to go. So I love my project list. You know I love my project list.
It's great, you know, and I think you bring up an important point. Managers, they're employees of another company. Mm-hmm. They do change jobs from time to time, and you may find yourself over a period of 5 years with more than one manager.
Exactly.
Sometimes more than two. They're not going to have the continuity to remember all of the projects you've done over that time period. But the people who are on the board live in the community. They only have one community to worry about, as you said. And if they keep this, you now have something that stays with the community in perpetuity. And I always like to say, you know, it's not the manager's community. It's your
yours.
community. And while you expect your manager to do a lot of things for you, keeping the history of your community is probably not going to be one of them.
Managers keep an inordinate amount of records and documentation, and so along with the completed project list, we keep our red book. This actually stays in the clubhouse, and it's like you said, you have changes in managers within an organization, you change vendors, well, you also change board members. And occasionally, you're going to need to know a little bit more than the name of a company or when the project was done. So in addition to the project list, you can refer back to your maintenance schedule. And this is very cool because it's got all these fabulous tabs in it, and you've got a project contract, you might have notes, copies of emails, you've got your timeline, completed schedules, and you've got references to everything that's been done so that any board member or any community member can take a look at this, they understand what's going on, where it was done, who did it, and why. So you've got the reserve study, your annual budget, you have the fabulous project list, which we must keep in our clubhouse, and then you've got even more detail available in your maintenance manual. And these are the things that I always refer to anytime our community is looking at a new project. Isn't that fun?
That is fun. You know,
see, I told you projects were fun.
It's fun when it's done.
That is very, very true.
One of the things that you then get into after you've gone through your reserve study and everything is, what are the problems you need to deal with?
Exactly.
Is it a maintenance issue? Is it a repair issue? Is it a replacement issue? Whatever it might be.
Is it something you have to do right now?
It's a problem-solving approach.
Exactly.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to solve these problems to determine what's going to be done. And it consists of a few steps. Identifying the scope of the problem. Is it a big one or a little one? Determining who has the authority or the obligation to fix it. What are the alternatives? Putting a plan together, communicating that plan, and monitoring and evaluating the plan itself. So I'm going to start off with the first step in problem solving, that is the scope of the problem. If you don't know what the scope of the problem is, it's pretty hard to do almost anything else.
True.
So where do you start? Well, what is it? Is it a leak? Is it are they pipes in the wall of a condominium? Is it the roof that's falling in or something? Who owns the fence that's having a problem? the size and complexity of the problem will have a direct impact on your plan. So do you need a general contractor? You can kind of figure that out pretty quickly. If you've got more than three different sub contractors involved, you're going to have a general contractor. Is it an emergency? Do you need help? All those things help you understand what you're faced with. And once you know what you're faced with, then you can go on to the remaining steps, which we're going to cover in segment 3 of this presentation. So stay with us and come back for the next segment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to our presentation on asset maintenance and reserves. I just previously covered the first step in problem solving, which was the scope of the project. What comes next?
Well, we actually need to identify who's going to be responsible for the problem. Is it going to be the association, the homeowner, the tenant, the insurance company? And this may sound like a silly thing to do, but I live in a condo complex, so you've got a variety of people who could be involved. Everybody or just one entity could be responsible for it. We start by looking at governing documents. The governing documents are going to give you good guidance, maybe not complete guidance, but good guidance on who's going to be responsible. And keep in mind, you're in single-family homes, we're in condos, you're going to have differences within the documents. So let's say you know somebody who lived in a condo complex. Don't sit in your board meeting saying, yes, but my friend told me, because it's going to be different.
Well, I know one thing in the single-family home community: if there's a leak in the roof, it isn't the association's fault.
No, it's not. But in a condo complex, you're going to be calling the management company.
Exactly.
Roofs, pipes, paint, landscaping, walls, any of these could have shared responsibility. Right now, we're looking at possibly having shared responsibility with the city of Las Vegas. We're replacing a perimeter wall, and one vendor told us, oh, just take it down, put it back up, you're fine. $50,000 project. Another one came in and said, well, $121,000 because your footings may be under the city sidewalk. And if so, then you've got to pull it up, put the sidewalk back down. Suddenly, you've got a whole different situation, and before we could even take one brick down, we had to determine whether the city was involved, and if so, how much. Once you've looked at your CC&Rs, once you've looked at your bylaws and articles and incorporation, that's where you're going to look also at a plat map, which is what we ultimately did with our fence. And keep in mind, NRS 116, that could override everything, because sometimes there are specific identifiers in NRS that take precedence over your own documentation. On important matters or any time it's fuzzy, you always have to talk to an expert. You need to talk to maybe a general contractor who's outside the project, talk to your attorney, talk to your reserve specialist. Anytime anybody is unsure, you need to make that call and take that money out of the budget to pay for it. There are so many regulations that address how the board is supposed to make these decisions. On a really large project, where do you go?
Well, it's more involved in a large project, obviously. If you're just trimming the trees, it's probably not such a big deal. But there's this thing called the Commission on Common Interest Communities and Condominium Hotels. And this commission is responsibility for jurisdiction over HOAs and condos and how boards make their decisions. And there are two elements that are really important related to what the commission will consider in determining whether you as a board have made a reasonable business decision as a board member. And if you haven't, you can be in a whole lot of trouble. There's thousands of dollars of fines that can be assessed against the board because they didn't bother to check with someone who actually knew what was going on. So there's two areas. One is you must consult with professionals anytime it's a complex project that the average person wouldn't not be knowledgeable about. And even if you happen to be or happen to have on your board someone who's knowledgeable about it, those people aren't necessarily allowed to guide the board because they may have a conflict of interest. You must consult with professionals. The second thing is, having done that, you, when practicable is the operative word.
Practicable?
Practicable.
Don't you mean practical?
I wish that meant that, but it does not actually, because practical means, it's convenient, easy to do. It doesn't mean that. Practical means it's possible, it's feasible, it can be done. Well, generally speaking, it can be done. I guess the only time it wouldn't be done is if you couldn't find enough vendors to give you 3 bids, which can happen in some cases. But the onus is on you as a board to make sure you've tried really hard to get those 3 bids. Unless a project is small and uses maybe an existing vendor that you have success with.
Okay, like removing a tree that's buckling a sidewalk.
Yeah, you may use your landscaper for that, perhaps. But if you're going to remove 20 trees, you might want to go out for a proposal, for example. Consult your attorney before you decide not to go out for bid. If you think, I'm not sure, let's not go out for bid because it's going to take longer. Before you do that, run it by your attorney, make sure that he says or she says, yeah, in this case you don't need to do that, because they're the experts. And then you'll be following the advice of a professional. Anytime you're not sure whether you should go out for bid or not, talk to your attorney or just go out for bid. Unless a project is understood by the board, doesn't require special knowledge, consider hiring a specialist who's knowledgeable in that area. You may not be able to decide the scope of the project because you're not competent to know what's involved when the sewer pipe breaks and you need to get a plumber involved and excavators and you've got to tear out some landscaping and so forth. It may need somebody to come in and advise you. So, your turn again.
Oh boy.
For some projects, timing is critical. You can't just do it whenever it happens. You have to have it done in a certain period of time. How do you know how long it's going to take? How do you do that? How do you make sure you have a finite time?
Well, a timeline is something that you need to establish as soon as you've selected your project. So you've gone through your documentation, you've got your project, you've figured out who's responsible, and now you're trying to create this process that everyone can follow so everyone stays on task with the entire project. When you're establishing a timeline, you don't just put in when the contractor is going to start the work on the wall and when he's expected to be finished. You need to...
That's what I want to know.
Well, but that's just a small part of your timeline. Think about it. Do you need to hire an expert? So we needed to get a general contractor in to take a look at that wall. We even had to get the city involved. You want to include that in your timeline. Create your RFP, which I always say incorrectly. Have your attorney take a look at it. Are you going to have to vet certain vendors before you even send out the bid? Then you've got to determine when you're going to have the bids returned. You need to identify if you're going to have a special meeting, maybe to open the bids or maybe just to talk to the homeowners that are going to be involved about it. Then you've got your project start and completion dates.
All these things you got to schedule out.
Every single one of these things. Plus then you've got a payment schedule. Your vendor needs to know when they can expect to be paid. Are you going to have to pay a deposit? When is final payment going to be made? And will final payment come with an inspection? Is that inspection going to require a specialist in order to come out and inspect? There are so many things that you've got to have identified in that timeline. And you shouldn't be afraid to hire an expert to help put it together. Your community manager does a lot of things and they're brilliant at project planning, but they may need somebody to assist them like a general contractor to make sure we're hitting all the fine points in our timeline. You've got to do as much as possible in the preparation in order to make sure that when that start and end date comes, it goes extremely smooth. It's got to include every single item you can think of. And then as you do the project, you may come up with other things to add in. All the steps have to be there to start and complete every single project. So as I'm doing my fabulous project timeline, I come across this one line item, and you know I have a horrible time with this acronym, RFP, Request for Proposal. You thought a timeline sounded kind of intense, especially the way I do it, but an RFP, this looks like a lot of work, and I'm wondering if it's someplace I could save some time by kind of cutting it back a bit.
Well, you can. You can totally avoid the RFP process if you like.
I can?
You can. you might not like the results.
Okay.
Because that's the way you could, the RFP is the thing that allows you to communicate to the potential vendors what you're expecting them to do.
Oh,
And
okay.
if you, when you've gone through all this whole process of deciding what it is that needs to be done and how you're going to get it done and how long it's going to take, all that kind of information needs to be in your request for proposal. Lots of stuff, key dates, key responsibilities. An RFP stands for request, as you said, request for proposal. You're asking the vendor to propose to you something that you need. And so that's what the request for proposal is all about. You want to make sure the licensing information's in there, the insurance requirements that your vendors, you want your vendors to have, and you know, if, for example, if it's a painting project, well, what kind of paint you want? What's going to be painted?
Well, aren't the vendors going to come out and check out the property, and wouldn't they know what kind of paint?
Well, they might, or the low vendor might have chosen a paint that's not quite as good. And they might be painting a homeowner's fence instead of yours because you didn't exactly explain it. So the RFP is the document that you use to try to avoid those kind of problems. You want to include everything that your vendor is going to need to fully respond to your request. The request for proposal is going to ensure that your bidders are bidding on the same job. You know, the RFP is important because you may be looking, you don't want to have one vendor bidding an apple and somebody else bidding an orange and somebody else bidding a pear, especially when you wanted a banana. You want them to come back with what you want, not what they think you want or what they think you might need. They may provide you with some guidance and say, you know, maybe that banana is too large or maybe that banana is too green. But the point is they're dealing with you on what you're looking for. You don't want, if you do things verbally, avoid the whole process. Just say, well, we need this fence painted and we need this. They'll come back with a proposal based on what they understood you said or think that you said or hope that you said, and they'll bid that because they're trying to get the contract. What you want is all those contractors bidding on the same thing. So your RFP is the document that you're communicating to them exactly what you want, how you want it, when you're going to pay, and so forth.
I guess that makes sense.
And the other thing is if you don't ask for it, you're very unlikely to get it.
True.
So stay tuned for our final segment where we'll cover this process in completion. Hi, and welcome back to our final segment of Asset Maintenance and Reserves. Kate, I just want to ask you about the sealed bid process. It's not very clear what that means.
The sealed bid process is the process wherein vendors supply you with sealed bids. They'll usually give them to the community manager, and then you open them at a properly noticed board meeting. This can be a little confusing for new board members, especially because they think you're just going to get the documentation, take a look at it, make a decision, and go. The problem is you don't get the documentation until your board meeting, so you really haven't had a chance to take a look at it, to compare the bids, to make sure it matches your RFP. So a lot of times what boards will do is one of two things. They'll either open it at the meeting, and then they'll postpone it until the next meeting, or maybe 2 meetings. That might work for a small project. But what if you only have quarterly meetings? Then you could actually put a project out 6 to 8 months by simply getting the sealed bids, opening them, and putting the project aside for now. The other option is to actually have a bid opening meeting. So when you send out the notice for your regular board meeting, you could also include a notice for a bid opening meeting that takes place about 10 days ahead of time. That way you could have one item on the agenda, and that is to open the bids. You open the bid, you can talk about it with the homeowners, you can give that information to community manager, and they can create some sort of analysis. So you're going to see, why is this vendor only bidding $50,000 and that one's bidding $121,000? Then by the time you get to your regular board meeting, you've had a chance to really look through this documentation, and you can keep a project on track that way. One of the major things that you're going to be looking at is, are these bids conforming to the RFP? What if, like we were talking about paint just a few minutes ago, what if one vendor has one paint color, but you've actually requested beige, they've given you brown? That can be a problem, especially if your documentation specifically says you have to have a certain color paint. Once you get these apples to apples comparison, you can, in the RFP, you can also make sure,
bananas.
or banana to banana. You can also make sure that your vendors have the right licenses. Are they giving you the same warranties? And you get all of that documented out.
This is the kind of stuff you can't do in the meeting. It just takes too long.
It really does.
So you have to do a separate meeting to open the bids, and then offline, someone is going to do all this work.
The other issue is that some people automatically want to go to the low bid no matter what, but sometimes a low bid isn't what you're going to need. For example, go back to the perimeter wall. I keep talking about that because it's obviously on my mind. If we'd gone with the low-end bid, $50,000, and they started the project and suddenly they realize those footings are on the city sidewalk, first of all, the project freezes, and then you get that fabulous change order that comes through, and suddenly your $50,000 project becomes a $150,000 project, and that was definitely not something you budgeted for. So taking the time with these sealed bids to properly analyze them can make a big difference. And guess what? You should be including this process for the sealed bids in your timeline as you're going forward.
Otherwise, you'll be behind schedule.
You got it.
Okay. Well, the other aspect of all this is now you've gotten the proposals back. You've analyzed them. You think you like this vendor the best. The board has voted on it. Now you get the contract.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, though, so I'm not really comfortable with contracts. What am I supposed to do once I get that back?
Well, the contract may or may not comply with what you asked for in the request for proposal, which would be a problem.
Okay, wait a minute. You mean that a vendor would give me a contract that didn't follow what they proposed?
Yeah, that's
I would just assume that it would be the same.
Well, assuming, as we all know, can be a problem. So someone knowledgeable enough has to go through that contract and say, yep, everything we put in our request for proposal is in there, plus a couple more things maybe, or, well, they changed one thing because what we had in our request for proposal actually wouldn't work. That happens. But is this contract something you're going to sign? And there's the legal aspects of this. Does it comply with your requirements? Is the warranty what you required? Does it have special waivers in the warranty that maybe you can have a warranty but it doesn't cover anything? You know, that happens. What are the payment terms? Are those payment terms, you know, all the money up front and nothing, and you don't pay any more until the end, you know? Will you find yourself in a financial situation where the vendor has very little incentive to continue the project? You've already given them all the money. So those kind of things are things you need to make sure the contract includes. Talking with your attorney, having your attorney review that contract. I have an attorney friend who says, you know, we always get paid. You can pay me now, a little, or you can pay me a whole lot later. And it's in the interest of the community to make sure that you're protected, that you've had the attorney look at it, it's a good contract, or maybe some changes need to be made. And then you know that you're not going to find yourself in a situation where you signed a contract you shouldn't have signed. And as you say, you want to avoid change orders. If that contract doesn't include everything in there, you're going to have to say, oh my gosh, we have to do this now because it wasn't in the contract. You can be mad at the vendor for not including it in the contract, but you still got to get it done. So, okay, we've gotten the contract, we're going to start this project. What about communicating with the owners? What has to be done there? Some things need to be communicated because the homeowners are affected by these things, right?
I don't think you can over-communicate with the homeowners. I know that they sometimes get annoyed by all of the communications they receive, but everyone consumes information differently. Some people are quick on their email, other people want that document in their hand. You've got newsletters, you've got door hangers, you've got email blasts, you've got text message alerts. Anything that you can use to communicate a situation to the homeowners is something you've got to take advantage of. And there are certain things that they're going to want to know. You have a choice. Either you communicate it to them, or someone else is going to create a fabulous story about it, and that's the communication that's going to rage
It'll be on
around your
Facebook.
complex. Oh, yeah. So it's much better if you, as a board and as a project committee, as you control those communications. You're going to want to tell them, are they going to have to vote on a special assessment? I always hear this, when in reality, we've had the money in the reserves for the project, so we tell them up front, it's being paid for out of the reserves. Are they going to be invited to be part of the project? Like with our clubhouse project, we invited them in and got their recommendations on how they wanted to redo certain sections of the clubhouse. Are they going to be inconvenienced during the project? Are they going to have to park somewhere else? And if you've got someone who has, for example, a disabled parking space, what accommodation are you going to need to make? You want to be the one to tell them, here are your options, instead of having them file a complaint somewhere because you're not meeting the ADA requirements. It's always important to let them know if they're going to have to change where they come in, if you're slurring a street, how long they need to stay off of it. And like I said before, where is this money coming from? Because you don't want anyone assuming that a big project means there's going to be a big check that they're going to have to write farther down the road. You've got to tell them when it starts, what the middle is, and when they can expect to see the completion. And if there are changes going on during it, remember those text blasts, email blasts, a notice on the notice board, these are the ways you're going to keep them happy. And if they're happy, your community manager's happy, and the board's happy, and even the vendors are happy.
Well, you know, there's an old saying, no one likes change unless it's their idea.
Nope.
So if you, as you say, get them involved in the process, they'll feel like they're connected to this idea and won't be, they'll know what to expect. Mm-hmm. If you communicate with them, they're going to know what to expect. They're not going to be surprised that they're going to have to park over there for a couple days. They're not going to be surprised that the clubhouse is going to be closed for renovations for a certain period. The pool is going to be out for an extra week. We're going to be a little bit late opening it up this season. If they know in advance, they're not going to be suddenly sending emails around to each other saying, what happened? Why isn't the pool working? So you're right, communication is really important.
The completion of the project is also something that you need to communicate just as much as you need to communicate all these other aspects, because the homeowners are going to want to know, was it checked out? Who signed off on it? Are there warranties? What happens as we go farther down the road?
It's their money.
It's their money, and it's critical that certain things take place. You need to tell those homeowners, we are having a general contractor come in to inspect the work. We are making certain we have all the warranty documentation on file. And we are making certain that that vendor is invested enough in our community that they're going to be willing to follow up on that warranty, and you're not going to have issues as you go down further into the years. You want to also make certain that you put that fabulous information on your completed project list and into your maintenance manual, because you go back to where you started. In 5 years, you may need to do some more work on the roofs.
Or somebody else may be looking at this.
Exactly. Somebody may want to know exactly what kind of paint was used when they corrected some graffiti. The reality is that you always wind up going right back to the start. Your annual budget, your reserve study, your project list, and your manual.
Well, you know, I think, Kate, I think our work is done here.
I hope so.
I would like to thank all of you for your attention, and we hope that this presentation was useful to you and your community, and will be useful, and that if you have questions or need other information or other presentations on other topics, please visit our website and download another one of these videos. Thank you.